I'm excited today to have an opportunity to interview Hallie Hearn. Hallie and I have never really met before. Hard as that is to believe, I mentioned to her when we were getting on the call today that, it seems like our church is a small church in a lot of ways, but boy, I'm always reminded in situations like this how big it is. And so I'm really excited about getting the chance to know you, Hallie, and I just want to thank you for being willing to take some time to share your story with us today.
You're welcome.
So maybe you could start by just, taking us back to the beginning for you, where your faith journey began.
Well, my faith journey is very wrapped up in this church. My great grandfather was Samuel Waite, who was the first pastor of this church.
Wow.
He also founded Wake Forest College, which was where the students were enrolled that started our church. So my bloodline is in the family of this church. I grew up in a Christian family, and of course the Christian church community in this church. My mother was Methodist and my father, of course, was Baptist, being from the Waite line. And mother was a very devout Methodist, and she said all those years that she would not be rebaptized. So if this church didn't want her the way she was, she wouldn't join. Well, by the time the church had changed to accept all members, she was in too bad health to go anymore. And I think she was so set in her ways, she probably wouldn't have done it even then. But she was very dedicated. She would go up and polish the brass railings about twice a year and lay down on the ground and polish the undersides. And some lady that was up there with her said, "Why in the world are you lying down polishing the bottoms?" And she said, "Because that's what the people on the ground floor see." So I grew up in that kind of community. My father was very much involved with the church. He was sort of the handyman of the time before they had, real people to do that.
Right.
But he was the chair of the Lord's Supper Committee for 50 years.
Wow.
He was on the committee for 53 years and chair for 50. And when I was in high school, I was on the committee. And so I would go up there on Sunday mornings and help fix the communion table. And it was a little more involved, I think, then. We had tablecloths, and Daddy was very meticulous, and he had to measure the tablecloth and be sure it was even on each side and all that sort of thing. And we had a most horrendous grape juice filler that would spill all over the trays, and you'd have to get a towel and go all in between the trays. But so that was how I came up. Well, I was baptized at the normal time that back then, people were baptized. And the seminary professors and their families their children were a lot the same age nearly as I was. So I was in that group of friends. And every time the church door opened, I was there. I was very involved with the music. At that time, we had Sunday night service as well as Sunday morning service. So in the morning, the adult choir would sing, and at night, the youth choir would sing. And I played the piano for the youth choir whenever the piano was used. Now, we used the organ just like the adult choir did a lot, but when the piano was needed, I played. So I really was involved with that aspect of the church. When I graduated from high school, I knew I wanted to go to Wake Forest University, obviously. But had it been in Wake Forest, I wouldn't have gone. I was going to go to UNCG, but it had moved to Winston-Salem by then. So I went to Wake Forest, and that was quite a learning religious experience for me. Not only in meeting people who had different religious perspectives. In fact, my freshman year roommate was Catholic. And other than the Byrne family, I had never really known any Catholics. So that was a learning experience. But a lot of my friends had told me when I first got there, they said, join the Baptist Student Union. and that will be a great benefit. So I did. But it wasn't just Baptist. There were lots of other people in there. One of my best friends was Presbyterian. And we started going to the Presbyterian church in Winston-Salem, which I don't know how much you know about North Carolina connections, but Richard Burr, who is our current senator, his father was the pastor of that church.
Oh.
So I went there for a long time, but I also visited other churches in the area. And the Baptist Student Union would do weekend ministerial retreats for us to lead at different churches. So we would go to different Baptist churches there and lead a weekend for the mostly young people, but everybody. And then when I graduated from Wake Forest, I went to work. And after a year, I got a job at Wake Forest University. And I thought, well, here's my chance to go to Wake Forest Baptist Church in Winston-Salem. But we just didn't connect. It's a very different kind of church, which surprised me from the way the church was here. I had thought that since a lot of the same people were in the church there that had been in the church here, but it was a lot different. And being a university church, I can sort of understand that. So I sort of had my quote rebellious streak, unquote, at that time. And I really wasn't rebelling, but I sort of quit going to church. And the longer the time went, the more I missed it. And I said, I've got to find a church for me in Winston-Salem, which sort of killed Mother and Daddy because they said, we want you to come back home. And
Right.
But so I found College Park Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, fell in love with it, joined the choir, worked with the children's choir, played for the Wednesday night family night supper, just really got real involved again. And about that time, my father, who had heart condition and prostate cancer, got very ill. And Mother had had a very severe, well, she had her hip replaced at that point and didn't do very well with it. But I started having to come home a lot on weekends. And I said, you know, for the choir, I feel guilty if I'm not here to practice and not here on Sundays, and I just can't give it the time. So I dropped out of the choir. But I still kept going to church there. But my father passed away. And then I felt like I needed to be here for Mother because all three of us were only children. Both my parents and myself were only children. So there wasn't anybody else to take care of her. And I thought, well, you know, this is going to be my life. I'm just going to have to take care of her. So she was still sort of mobile at that time. And at 48 years old, well, about 46 years old, I met John. And at 48, I got married.
Oh.
First time for both of us. So I thought, well, this is great. And he lived in Raleigh and I lived in Winston-Salem. And he volunteered, let's move back to Wake Forest and you can take care of your mother and it'll be a shorter commute to my job than where I'm living now. And so that's what we did. Well, the longer we were married, the worse Mother got, unfortunately. And I spent all my time, she didn't want anybody else to be with her except John or me. So I got out of church again. I couldn't go. I always had to be with her. And she died in December of 2013. John and I had been married 11 years. And he had been so wonderful. And I said, I have to devote time to what he wants to do for a while because he's given up everything. So we traveled a lot at that point. We took a 5-week trip cross country and we went to New England and did some things like that. Well, still I was out of the church. But I said, I got to go back to church and this is my home church. So I had already rejoined before that, but I started going back. And the real impetus was the history book.
Oh, wow.
And because it had been my family, I felt a real connection to the writing of the history book. And I don't have children and won't ever have children. And I said, well, this is going to be my legacy. So I funded the authorship of the book. I didn't tell anybody at first, except, of course, the preacher and the financial secretary, and Joanne, that I was doing it, because I did not want the committee to feel pressured. Since I was on the book committee, I did not want my input to have more pressure than it should have. I wanted to be an equal partner. They all knew my history, but they didn't know about that. But when we got ready to publish the book and we were writing the dedications, I said, because I wanted this to be my legacy and my memory to my ancestors. So that sort of got me back in the swing of things. And I also joined the senior choir, the Joy Choir, which I truly love. I had a little trouble with my voice right at the end before COVID hit. So I was glad to have that break to kind of get over that. But I really did enjoy that. And so that's where I am today. I'm still COVID feared, but I'm a little, John and I are both immunocompromised. And so we're afraid to get in indoor crowds still.
Right.
But I'm hoping that will go away rapidly and we'll be back to normal.
Right. Well, I've got a few questions if this would be a
Okay.
good time for me. Yeah, I got tons of questions actually.
Okay.
So Wake Forest Baptist Church here in Wake Forest, you've been in this church from day one.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you're amongst a small group of people.
Yes.
They can probably say that, but that's interesting. Number one. Now, were you, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but were you in Wake Forest? Your dad was part of the seminary?
No,
Okay.
he had taught, well, he went to Wake Forest College and then taught while he was in grad school at State. He taught at Wake Forest
Okay.
and he stayed at Wake Forest, but he did not want to move to Winston-Salem. So
Got
his
it.
father had an electrical contracting company, and Daddy
Okay.
had also been a land surveyor when they taught that at college. So he brought land surveying into his father's business and took up plumbing and electrical contracting. So he was just here as a businessman.
Okay. But somebody in his lineage had always been in Wake Forest, right?
That's correct. I'm
Yeah.
sixth generation in this
Sixth
church.
generation.
Mhm.
Yeah, I couldn't keep up with how many of the great grandfathers, but I thought it
Three.
was three. Okay.
Three, yes.
Wow,
My
that's
grandmother's, who I'm named for, my grandmother Hallie, sang in the choir.
ah,
And when she died, they draped her choir chair with black cloth for her funeral, or sometime
wow.
after that. I'm not sure exactly how long, but so we've always been involved in that. Well, it
Right.
skipped my father's generation. But,
Did the college move to Winston-Salem when you were in what, high school?
no, I was 2.
Oh, okay. So it
I'm not as
moved.
old as I look.
So so you don't so you wouldn't have had a real life memory of that. I got you. Okay.
No, I remember the seminary in the good
Yeah.
old days, but
Yeah. Right. Right.
not the
Okay.
college.
Now, when you went to Wake Forest, what did you study there?
I started out as a history major. I had thought I
Okay.
wanted to teach high school history, but things at that time were going south in high schools. And as I was doing all this religious learning, I decided to change my major to religion. And I thought at the time, when I graduated, that I was going to seminary and do music and youth. But people would say, if you want to get into church work, being a woman, you either have to have a master's degree and get in a big church where they can afford
Mhm.
that, or you're not going to have much of a chance.
Yeah.
So that didn't work out, but that was okay.
So you studied history when you were there
And then changed to religion.
and
So
then
I did
changed to
keep a religion major,
okay,
but
gotcha.
I took a lot of history classes.
Now, was Wake Forest University where was that your first job, like career position coming out of?
No,
Okay.
I worked for 9 months as a leasing agent at an apartment complex,
Okay.
and never was I more glad to get out of anything. Well, I shouldn't say that, but I was glad to get out of there. So I actually had applied at Wake Forest and they didn't have
Yeah.
any openings at that time. So I worked 9 months. They called me the day after I had accepted the job at the other place. And loyal little girl me said, well, I've already taken this and I can't go back on my word. So try me again another time. And they did. So I was lucky about that.
And what did you do at Wake Forest?
Well, I worked in the registrar's office
Okay.
and sort of came up through the ranks. And when the divinity school was reformed in the 90s, the late 90s, they made me the first registrar of the divinity school. So it kind of came full circle. I had hoped to become the registrar when the registrar retired. And that's a long story, but to make it short, I didn't get the job. But I
Okay.
stayed 3 more years after that. So
Okay.
um, it was all good.
Yeah. Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, and then you said you and John met, I think, you said you were about 48 or something when you got married, if I
40, I
remember.
was 48 when I got married, yes.
Now, and how did y'all meet?
Well, that was a secret for a long time. We met on the computer.
Oh, okay.
And after we talked on the computer for a while, we found out we had been connected through a lot of things we didn't realize. For instance, John had worked for a while at Schrader Bellows here in Wake Forest, where Daddy did a lot of work, but I never did go out there. But it was sort of interesting to think maybe they met each other and they didn't even know it,
Right.
at that
Right.
time. So there were a lot of common denominators there, and we didn't meet for over a year. And then once we did meet, we saw each other practically every week until we got married. So thank goodness he loves to drive. I don't. To come to see me in Winston-Salem. And then when I was home, he would come here to Wake Forest and visit me here with Mother. So it worked out very nicely.
And what does John do?
He's retired now. He did work for the state in the Department of Agriculture, but he's a computer programmer. He worked in
Oh,
Butner for the Food Distribution Agency of the
okay.
state. And he's
Very good.
Methodist, so Mother was happy with that. But he comes to church here most of the time. So.
Very good, very good. Well, switching over to the book now,
Yes,
what was that like? I mean, that had to be a really neat experience for you, huh?
it was, and it still is. Um, Things will come up, and I'll think back to the book and think, well, that was a nice connection with that. But Sean did so much research and did such a good job. And the people who were on the committee were so dedicated. We all wanted not only a factual book, but an interesting book. And I think we got that.
Yeah.
So learning all these new things, there was a period in there that I didn't know much about what was happening, before I was born. So that was very interesting to
Hmm.
learn all those little details that I didn't know, and to know some details that other people didn't know from other periods for me to
Right.
share was nice too. But I met several new people there. Doug Smith did a great job of
Mhm.
chairing that committee, just a wonderful job. And Janice Ishikawa volunteered. She wasn't even appointed to the committee. She just came on, and bless her heart, I don't know what we would have done without her. And Beverly and and Shirley Wooten, and I know I'm missing somebody. But everybody was just so interested. Gene Fisher and just all the others. It was great. And please forgive me if I forgot anybody.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just a side note, my wife and I read the book cover to cover.
Good.
Um, we came to Wake Forest Baptist Church in 1995.
Mhm,
So we've been here a while, but certainly did not really know the history, and found it to be fascinating. And
mhm,
and I agree with you, scholarly and entertaining at
mhm.
the same time. And so it was interesting because our home church is Edenton Baptist Church.
Ah, where
That's
Samuel
where,
White was.
right,
Yes.
right. And Dr. Jesse Kroom
Mhm,
wrote a history of Eden Baptist Church about 2 years before our history came out.
mhm,
And so we had just read Eden's history, and then reading, and both churches are mentioned in both books. And
mhm.
I think Eden Baptist Church it's either 20 years older or 20 years younger, but both have a
Probably
dome.
older.
Yeah, both have a dome, both have a
Mhm,
balcony. I mean,
mhm,
it's like you could tell both church architectures were about the same time.
mhm.
But fascinating to see the connection between the churches in Eastern North Carolina, in the ones here in this area during that time, and how people like Thomas Meredith traveled amongst all of them.
Right.
So yeah. So thank you for your role in that. And
Well, I'm proud to have been able to do that, and a lot of other people did a whole lot. So I'm glad it was a community effort.
when you look back and think back over your faith journey, do you think that was something was that a God thing for you to be involved in that?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, I was sitting in church thinking about it, and I didn't even talk to John about it. I just turned around at the end of the service to Joanne and I said, I feel led to do
Hmm.
this for the church. And it's been a long time since I've felt something that strongly, but
Well,
I'm glad it came along.
well, I got a little bit of goosebumps as we're talking here, just thinking about, wow, she started in this church, and here she is years later. God's led this to put this on her heart, and people for many, many years to come will be able to benefit from that work. So what a wonderful gift. What a
Well, now
wonderful gift.
somebody can pick up the record and start. And we stopped at 2005, I think.
Right.
So there's a lot of time already to catch up.
Well, that's awesome. That is awesome. Well, let's change gears again and talk a little bit about, what you're up to these days. What are you doing for fun these days?
Well, like I said, I've been in during COVID. I haven't gotten it yet, thank goodness.
Yeah, that's
But
great.
for fun, I play the piano for myself. Um, I'm not as good as I used to be. I got kind of rusty in my old age, but I also like to garden.
Okay.
And I'm getting to the point now that all of a sudden, about 2 years ago, I found out my body is reacting to having to stoop and bend, and I can't get on my knees at all. And so I don't know how much longer that's going to work until the raised beds are the predominant thing. But I do love flowers and gardening and all that. I have, since Ancestry.com came into being, I've been a real genealogy nut. I enjoy that very much. So I like to cook, but I don't like to clean.
Uh-huh.
So, so when I get in the mood to think, well, I can wash all these dishes if I cook enough, then I'll cook some. But I do. John and I both have to be careful. I'm diabetic and he has a heart condition. So it's a fun time experimenting with things that you can use artificial sugar and not too much fat on, but
Right.
he seems
Right.
to eat what I cook, so.
There you go. There you go. Are you involved in anything in particular at the church or in the community? Or I know
Well,
COVID is kind of probably put
yeah.
a disruption to some of that, but
Well,
normally,
at the church, I'm the chair of the history committee now, but we've
okay,
sort of been on hiatus. Um, our next big project will be when the music wing is finished, because our archives room for the history artifacts and papers
right.
is in the music wing. So as soon as we get that going, we'll be having to move all of our stuff. And Janice Ishikawa has done a great job of cataloging what we have, and she's sort of tried to get it in some semblance of order in that little tiny room that we have, but we hope that will be coming along. And if the choir starts back, I'll try to, the Joy Choir.
Just,
But in town, I am on the board of the Wake Forest Museum.
oh, okay.
So I do a lot with that. I'm also on the Wake Forest Christmas Dinner Committee, and I'm sort of their unofficial caroling leader. The tradition there is that we end the dinner with caroling. So I got myself a pitch pipe, and we have fun with that.
You mentioned the church's history room. There's probably some people who will listen to this that may or may not really know what that is.
Well,
Talk for just a moment. Yeah.
we have two, actually. We have the Blackburn room, which is right off the sanctuary, which houses some documents and some artifacts. We would love to have more things. One of the things, I will digress a little bit because I'm so proud of it. One of the things in there is the original communion set.
Oh,
And that had been lost for a while, I guess, when we got the new one, whenever that was. But my father was out working at a house, crawling under the house doing something, and saw this little silver thing sticking out of the ground, and he saw WFBC on it. And he pulled it out of the ground, and it was a communion cup from the church. So he went in and asked whoever lived there if he could buy it. And they said, yes. And he said, well, can I dig around some more? And they said, well, yeah, I think there's some more pieces under there. So he dug around and found whatever else was there and bought it for the church. And Shirley and John Wooten had it resilvered because it was in such bad shape. And I found out when we were doing the book that the Pascals, who were very prominent in town and at the church, had given the plates, and they had 10 children, and they gave one plate for each child. So that's how we have 10 communion plates.
ah,
But so that's in a case in the Blackburn room, along with the book, the first book of minutes of the church, that is opened to the page that talks about naming the church. That the name will be Wake Forest Baptist Church. And a copy of the history book and the pictorial supplement is in that room for people to. We did have two copies. We had one inside a case and one that they could flip through, and the one that could be flipped through disappeared. So I hope somebody's enjoying it.
yeah.
But, in any case, so that's one room, and then that's also used as the welcome center.
The Welcome Center. That's what I
Right.
was thinking, right?
And then we have the archives room, which stores the not so pretty but important records, which is downstairs in the music wing. And so anything that we can get our hands on, we put there. And we are discussing the new trend to not having paper, because
Right.
that is difficult for historians. How do you keep track of all of these digital things that are important so that people will have them in the never land when you don't know what kind of technology there's going to be.
Right, right.
So, that's something to be thought about.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thanks for the work that you do on that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're so fortunate to have people who have some passion for the history, and we all benefit from it when people take the time to preserve it. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
How about Hallie? What about from when we get maybe talk just a little bit about some of what you do to what are the things that you find valuable in your spiritual life? Are there any practices or routines or Bible verses or just anything like that that you might share that are things that are important to you and keeping you close to God?
Well, of course, the music is important. Um, 2 years ago for Christmas, John gave me a copy of the accompanist hymnal that we use in our church. And I don't know if you know anything about that, but the accompanist hymnal is is in a 3-ring binder so that it will lay flat
Okay,
on the
makes sense.
instrument. And I have just adored that. I just sit down with that and just play through that occasionally. But my favorite hymns have my favorite hymns and my favorite scriptures are often connected.
Hmm.
I know that going back to my teenage years, I took the sign language class with Joanne and Neil Payton when I was in high school. And one of the things we learned was the Lord's Prayer to the song, to the hymn. And so that's always been one of my favorite things. I also love the Hallelujah chorus, obviously. In fact, I used to have the nickname Hallelujah, and that's how when I'm working with children's groups, that's how I tell them they can remember my name and then I explain what Hallelujah means and that kind of thing. But in terms of scriptures, I have two, and one of those is connected with music because it was an anthem that I learned from Micah 6:8, and I think the pastor, excuse me, Bill, preached on that not too long ago. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That really speaks to me about, even though it's not from the New Testament, about things. But two of the rituals that I have, one is I try to walk outside as often as I can when the weather's cooperating. And while I walk, North Main Street is a mile up and down. It's half a mile each way. And that's my sort of meditation time that I think about spiritual things and try to connect. Also, I have a dear college friend who is a chaplain now, and he is so thoughtful, and he writes poetry. And almost every day he posts a comment or a poem or something on Facebook. And I get quite a lot from reading his thoughts. So those are two things that I really try to do, and connect that with my scripture and that sort of thing.
Very good. Very good. Hallie, is there anything else that I should be asking you that you maybe have thought about that would be something you'd want to share about your faith journey? Anything that maybe I hadn't thought about that as we move towards a close here, is there anything else that you would want to add or talk about?
I think God has always been present in my life. I've never been one to be a soapbox, stand on and shout and scream about my Christianity and that sort of thing, but I've always tried to show it. And sometimes I don't realize it at the time, but looking back on it, I think God has led me in times that I didn't realize I was being led. Um,
Mm.
I think the college experience was something I treasure, um, leading me to care for my parents. Um, I didn't mention that my grandmother had lived with us for many years when I was a teenager, and I saw my mother having to take care of her. And at the time, I sort of resented it. You know how teenagers are, they don't even want one mother, much less two mothers.
Right.
And
Right.
so I didn't quite understand. But then when I had to take care of mother, I regret very much that I did not know as much about dementia and things like that as I do since she's passed. I feel very guilty that I did not have the patience with her that I should have had, the understanding that I should have had. I did not realize that people with dementia don't know what reality is. And I didn't understand quite how to cope with, when she would say, bring me that dress, and there was no dress, that sort of thing. I didn't know quite how to do that. But God got me through it. I'm still working on the guilt part, but he got me through that. And then I think most of all was meeting John. That was just out of the blue. Um, and it could have gone so much worse. You hear about all these, meet somebody off the computer and you get serial killer or something. But he has been such a blessing, and we just seem to make such a good team that the differences we have complement each other. And when we agree to disagree, that's okay. I don't think we've ever had a really serious fight. I think God's blessing on that was the biggest thing, short of my salvation, that I can think of.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Well, one of the questions I always like to ask when we close here is, what is it that me and others who might be listening to this, what can we pray for you about?
Well, that's a good question. Um, Obviously, our health, um, and our strength of conviction. Um, I hope not so much for the prayers, but the hope that the situation will be so we can get back to a normal life. I really am feeling very keenly about the Ukraine situation too.
Mm,
That's not just for me, but I have one of the men who was an usher in our wedding has a very dear friend in Ukraine.
mm,
So we get a little bit of, well, and of course, Mrs. Chanley's daughter-in-law, her family is in Ukraine. So I feel more connected than just, oh, they're having a war over there,
right.
And I'm feeling very not confused, but mixed feelings about somebody should do something.
Right.
But do you want to provoke even a worse situation, or are we going to have a worse situation anyway? So I'm a little, I need prayers for a little more clarity on that, and definitely prayers for peace.
Yeah. 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 We all need that for
Mhm,
sure.
mhm.
All need that for sure. Well, thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk. It's, gosh, been wonderful to hear a little bit about your story, and again, the whole thing with the history book and that whole, to me, that is that's quite a story. And thank you for your involvement in that particularly. But
Oh,
uh,
sure.
but thank you for all you do, and we just wish the best for you, and we'll
Thank
have you
you.
in our prayers, and I look forward soon to maybe be able to meet you in person.
Well, definitely, I do too. And I hope somebody's going to do a podcast with you.
Well, I'm sure we'll get around to that sooner or later. But
Okay.
well, thank you, Hallie, and
Sure.
God bless you.
Thank you.